welcome. So glad we were able to do this while you were here. And I just want to publicly, for the tape, on behalf of David and I, since we are now celebrating our 15th International Humanitarian Law Roundtable, which started in Bowling Green, publicly apologize for snubbing you while we walked out on your presentation so we could talk at a coffee shop and create the seed for what became now the 15th International Humanitarian Law Roundtable. And little did I realize when I went back and timelined it that it was Brenda Hollis who was speaking at Bowling Green when we left.
Well, apology accepted.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Where were you born? And talk about
I was actually born in Washington, D.C., Columbia Hospital for Women. Don't have much of a memory of it. I was about 8 weeks old when we went to Alabama, and then lived in Alabama and Georgia till I was about 8 or 9, and then moved between Ohio and Alabama and Georgia until I was about 13, 14.
Tell me about your mom and dad.
Don't know anything about my father.
Okay.
My mother, I give thanks every day. Anything that's good about me is because of my mother. A very strong woman, dignified, very respectful of others, honest to the core, and tolerated much from my sister and myself, but never dishonesty, discourtesy, asking for something. Those were things that she wouldn't allow. And like so many women of her age, a woman of strength without knowing she was a woman of strength. So I had a very good role model when I was growing up.
Was religion part of your mother's background? And
part of my family's background, my great-grandmother was religious, very fundamentalist Christian in the South, and many of my family were. My mother was not so religious, and so was accepting of the fact that my sister and I were not really religious.
So, high school, where did you go there?
McClure, Ohio.
Where is that?
It's about half an hour, 45 minutes from Toledo, up in northwest Ohio. Very small farming community. When I was there, I think, when we lived there were 800 some people. We had still had an operator and a phone service with different rings. And I remember being in Southeast Asia and wanting to use the Mars line to call home. And when you would get on the line, you had to give them the number, and our phone number was 64. And so the operator would keep waiting for the rest of the number, and that was it. And they could never put them through.
Yeah. Was it a party line?
Well, no, I think we actually had a private line.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very few people even know what we talk about when we use the term party line.
I think not.
Oh, wow. And so from there, college, was that just a normal thing for you to do, or were you the first kid in?
First in my family to go to university. And it was something I wanted to do. I didn't have a career path in mind. I've never had a career path in mind. But there were so many exciting things to learn about. And I could do that at university. And so I was fortunate they had begun the honors program, so I could take extra classes. And I would still go early to school to go to the bookstore and get books for classes I couldn't take because I had maxed out my hours, but they were interesting, so I'd get these textbooks as well. But university was a wonderful experience for me because—
Bowling Green? Bowling Green?
Bowling Green State University. And I also, for the first time, was able to play sports competitively because when I was growing up in Ohio, girls were not allowed to have organized sports. I guess they thought we were too fragile a flower to have sports. So at Bowling Green, I was able to play on intercollegiate teams for basketball, softball, and field hockey, which I didn't know anything about, field hockey. But I went out for it. I could run, so they made me a wing. And I remember our first match was at Bowling Green, and a lady whose husband was my softball coach was the official. And so she would blow the whistle and then tell me what to do because I still didn't know what the rules of field hockey were. But it was good. So it combined really being able to develop my physical potential at the same time I could develop my mental and intellectual potential.
So Bowling Green, and you graduated what year?
Oh, I graduated in 1968, and then I went back in 1970.
Okay. Did you know, kind of leaving college, that you wanted to kind of get into the social justice part of this? I know you.
No.
No?
No, I had 2 job offers when I graduated. One was with the CIA and the other was with the Peace Corps. And I took the Peace Corps and went to West Africa as a public health worker. I had no background in public health, but it was very basic stuff. So I was in Senegal and Niger, and then went back and took a lot of psychology courses. I was there.
So this would have been 69, you would have done the Peace Corps?
Yeah, 70 I went back, and 68, 69 Peace Corps, 70 I went back, took a lot of psychology courses, but also because I hadn't played intercollegiate basketball my first year, I was able to play intercollegiate basketball that year as well. So
you're one of those extraordinary academics that they talk about.
Well, you know, today you couldn't do it. I played 3 sports, but today the schedules are much longer, the training is much longer. You kind of are stuck with one sport. But I was fortunate that I could do all that because it was so interesting.
Peace Corps, and then you launch after you get done with college. What's your next step?
Well, I went back to university. In the meantime, my sister had become the first female in our family to join the military.
Huh?
We have a family of service. All of the men served. That was just what you did. If you were an American, you served in the military. They were all enlisted. In fact, my stepfather, my half-sister's father, went to Korea. Last boy in the family went to Korea, left perhaps not even knowing that my mother was pregnant with his child, and then left in August, and then in November was reported missing at the fighting at the Chosin Reservoir. And his body was never found. And then my sister was born the following April, so never knew her father. And my mother lost, I'm sure, the love of her life. And you know, the interesting thing is, it was a horrible loss for her. But there was never a recrimination about why did he go, why did he serve, why is the United States doing this? Because she also had a sense of duty and obligation, and it was horrible that he died, but he died in service of the United States.
So you would have been, your stepfather dies, you would have been 5?
Yeah, when my sister was born, I was almost 5.
Yeah.
And I remember being in Ohio. He was from Ohio. We were with his mother. And I remember it was cold, and my step-grandmother had a big stove in the room that, as you came into her house, there was a big stove there that heated the house. And there was someone who came to the door and gave something to my mother. And she read it, and she just burst into tears. And then my step-grandmother came out, and they were both crying, and I was frightened. I remember hiding behind the stove. I had no idea what was going on. And that was the notice that he was missing in action. And then when they had the armistice, I remember we were then in Alabama, and they read the list of POWs being returned to the U.S. And I remember laying next to my mother with my head on her leg as she sat there all night listening to those names, and his name was never one of them. So service, very much a part of what I grew up with.
And accordingly, you did go into the service right after college?
I did. My sister told a recruiter about me, and it sounded like something I'd be interested in, so I went into the Air Force as an air intelligence briefing officer, trained at Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado. That began my love affair with Colorado.
But also, you ultimately became a JAG in the Corps.
That's right. That's right. I went to Southeast Asia. I had orders for Vietnam, and then I was at home. It was over Christmas. I was home on leave before going to Vietnam, And I got a call saying that my orders were on hold because, unbeknownst to apparently all of us, there had been an agreement between Department of Defense and the State Department that if someone had been a Peace Corps volunteer, there would be a break in service of something like 4 years before they could do anything in an intelligence capacity, because they didn't want governments to be able to say they were just sending spies. And so it took almost a year to get a waiver of that for me. And by that time, they sent me to the 8th TAC Fighter Wing at Ubon Air Base in Thailand. And so I spent a year as a briefing officer there, briefing F-4 crews, AC-130 crews.
On what were you briefing them on?
Well, as the briefing officer, I briefed them on the air-to-ground threat, target information, egress routes, that type of thing.
And you were getting that information from where?
Oh, you got it from all of your intel sources.
Yeah.
It was an intelligence function. You got it also, of course, we had recon aircraft that would fly after missions, that would also do oversight of the areas. We had other aircraft that were doing reconnaissance, so we had multiple sources of information about that.
Was there a sense within the service at that time regarding the politics of Vietnam?
You know, not really. We were there doing a job that put the pilots' lives at risk every time they went up.
Right.
And so we were focused on that. It was only when I went back that I realized how strong the feeling was. And quite honestly, it was a very shameful period, I think, for the United States, because support or don't support the war, the overwhelming majority of people that went there served honorably, and they served their country. Many died there or were hurt, and they didn't get the welcome that they deserved, nor the care that they deserved when they came back. And so I think it was a shameful period, regardless of your thoughts about the Vietnam War.
Did you go to law school during this time period?
I went back. Then I went to Denver, because I loved Colorado. And so by now, I got an early release from active duty, so now I was in the Air Force Reserves. There were so many intelligence officers that they had created for Vietnam, for the conflict. There were so many of us, the chances for promotion weren't that good. So I went into the reserves, went back to Denver, and then for a year looked for a job. But I was a liberal arts graduate with all the fuzzy sciences. I had been a Peace Corps volunteer in public health, and I had been an air intelligence briefing officer. It's kind of hard to fit that into a civilian job. And at that time, Colorado was very popular with professionals, so in Denver you had a lot of people with masters and PhDs, and I really couldn't find a job. I pumped gas for a while, I did all these things, and I played a lot of sports. And one of the people I played sports with said, well, why don't you take the law school admission test? And so I thought, well, it's better to be an unemployed student than just unemployed. So I took the test, deciding that if I did well enough to go to the University of Denver, then I'd go to law school. I didn't want to leave Denver, so, and I did well enough to do that. So I went to law school, but basically I went to law school because I couldn't find a job.
But you get through law school, and
I'm still shocked that I did, but yeah, my favorite courses, oddly enough, included tax law for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but I was fascinated with it. But I also liked torts, criminal law, and international law. Had a great professor in international law, Vednanda, and I missed a lot of classes in law school, but I never missed his class. Yeah. So, and then I graduated, took the bar, and I had gone to law school with several officers from the military. Some of them, the military was paying for them to go. Others, they were given leave to go. And so they convinced me to go back in as a judge advocate. So that's what I did. Went back into the Air Force.
as JAG, just for the camera, what's the role there? You hear the term, but what's that really mean?
Multiple roles. It's a part of the military. In the U.S. military, as a JAG, you are combatant, eligible for command. So you're not like a doctor or a chaplain where you're a non-combatant. But you have a multiple multiple roles. You are advisors to commanders in terms of targeting, weaponry, attack strategies. You are one who does bomb damage assessment after you do strikes. You brief before strikes. You provide general legal advice to service members. So you help them with their taxes, wills, powers of attorney. You deal with commanders in terms of contracting. So it's within the JAG Corps, you have attorneys doing everything that the broad spectrum of attorneys do in civilian society.
Did you go back to Vietnam?
Didn't go to Vietnam, but I went to Korea.
Korea,
I was in Korea for a year at Kunsan Air Base, Kunsan by the sea, which you couldn't enjoy because it was mined, so the North Koreans couldn't land there. And it was a attack base, but with a very different mission, of course. And that was the support of South Korea and that area based on U.S. interests there. So I was there for a year, and then I went back. I did a few trials there, and I went back.
Were these court-martial type?
Courts-martials, 3, I think. And then I went back, and they chose me to be a circuit trial counsel. And the military, the Air Force, I think, may have been the first service to do it, but they had realized that there was an issue about how we did trials. There was at least an appearance that there was too much command involvement in it. So at a point in time, you wouldn't even have an attorney as the head of the court-martial, and the commander would have a lot of control over the court-martial. And so the Air Force decided they would break out the judicial arm that did courts-martials and discharge boards. And so they created an entirely different division that would handle all of that. And then, so we had circuits. We had the world divided into, I think at that time, 7 circuits. I went to Lowry, which was a large circuit. We covered all the northern tier states, New Mexico, Alaska, the Upper Peninsula and Michigan was within our circuit. And we did all of the major the general courts-martial that deal with the most serious offenses. We did all officer discharge boards. But in there, you had full-time defense counsel as well, who worked with defense counsel on the basis to do these more serious cases. And we had full-time judges. And then it went up through that chain as the results of the court-martial were reviewed initially by military judges, and then up to what at that time was the Court of Military Appeals. It's now the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. But those are civilian judges nominated by the president and then approved by the Senate. And so cases would move up to them from all of the services. So I was at the trial level for a time, became the Chief Circuit Trial Counsel, and then went to the Appellate Division. And before I left the Air Force, was the head of the Government Trial and Appellate Division. So in charge of all of the prosecutors on the circuits and at the bases.
So they would strike you that you were already at this point in your career, and you've had a full career. You know?
I did have a full career.
Yeah, you haven't kicked into why you're here. And at the same time, and I was curious about the military aspect of it. Can it then jump into the federal court system? I mean, you got this military tribunal mechanism.
We go from the court-martial, and then the convening authority looks at what happened and either approves it or says, no, I'll reduce the sentence or something. But then it can go to the military judges for the first level of appeal, then up to the civilian judge court, Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. But from there, you have the ability to go to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so it's jurisdiction.
And in fact, while I was on active duty, we had one case that did go to the Supreme Court. Now, when it goes to the Supreme Court, then the military prosecutors may work with the Solicitor General of the United States to brief them on the case, but the Solicitor General does the argument before the Supreme Court.
How fascinating. Interesting. So then your time of duty with the Air Force is over.
No, I was up for promotion to colonel. And my boss, the Judge Advocate General of the Air Force, said, Brenda, if you want to be promoted, you have to avoid the 2 C's, Colorado and criminal law. So they sent me to be the head of the legal office at Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany.
Okay.
Which was a military airlift command base. So it was C-130s, 141s. And so I was there for 2 years. And during that time, we were flying food drops into Bosnia. We had, I think the French may have been involved, the Germans were involved. And so our base was flying those missions into Bosnia, but I still knew very little about the Bosnian conflict. And then we had an issue arise, and the deputy prosecutor of the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, came to our base. And I remember getting his business card, and they had the official name for the Yugoslav Tribunal is very, very long, and the entire name was on this business card. So he had this huge business card, and I thought, what in the world is this? That was my introduction to the ICTY. And then when my time there was drawing to an end, my promotion board had met. I had been selected for promotion. And about that time, the ICTY had been in existence for about a year. The judges had been there, and now they had nothing to do because the prosecution had to investigate and indict, and they didn't have many staff. So the United States and other countries loaned people to the Office of the Prosecutor. And so I got a call again from my boss, the Judge Advocate General, who said, Brenda, when you finish here, you're going up the road to The Hague, and you're going to work at this tribunal in the Office of the Prosecutor. So being a military officer, you salute smartly and you go up the road. So that's how I began my international career in criminal law.
Wow. At the time, the prosecutor was at Goldstone?
Yes, it was, well, in fact, when I went, they still hadn't brought the prosecutor on. It was the deputy prosecutor, and there were maybe at that time 12 of us, maybe. And we were in this, the Aegon building, which was Aegon Insurance Company. We had offices there. And we would need to have desks set up. And they would say, well, we can do it in a month. And so we would go get them and bring them and carry them in because we needed it. So we got in trouble with their maintenance people because that was for them to do. And then the big fight was over the wastebasket and the one copy of the expert report that we were reviewing. So, but yeah, there were very few of us. And then more secundees came on, and then more staff came on, and Justice Goldstone came on. He was our first prosecutor. And after that was Louise Arbour, and I worked for her as well.
Was it organized in a sense, or was it organized chaos as they were creating this tribunal?
You know, it was organized in the sense that we had the organs of the court, we had the mandate for those organs, we had the legal framework and the statute, we knew what we had to do. It was disorganized in the sense of bringing people on, and just when you bring new people into an organization, there's administrative things to do. You've got to learn the legal framework you're in. And remember, at that time, there had not been an international criminal court since Nuremberg, but the law had moved on. So what was the law in relation to these crimes we had jurisdiction over? What was the procedure now in place? And so a lot of what we did initially was to just internally decide what is the prosecution position on this. So, for example, I was fortunate to be one of the co-counsel, not lead counsel, but co-counsel on the Duško Tadić case, which has become a very important case.
It was the first litigated case, right?
First litigated case since Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And our lead counsel was from Australia, Grant Neiman. And Alan Teeger, I think he came to us from DOJ, Department of Justice, and then another military lawyer, Michael Keegan, from the Marine Corps. So we were the trial team. And so we gave our pretrial brief, and we had charged crimes against humanity and violations of war and all these things. And so our pretrial brief, though, was here's what we say the elements are, and here's what we think the definitions are, not just of the crimes, but of the forms of liability. And so we presented the pretrial brief, the defense presented it, we had oral argument. Then we waited for the judges to tell us, what do we have to prove? Because we had some differences in terms of what the elements even were. For example, with crimes against humanity, it has to be a part of an attack against a civilian population. But does that attack have to be widespread and systematic? Or is it widespread or systematic? That makes a difference if you have a burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt. So we were waiting for the judges to tell us, here's what you have to prove. Nothing, nothing, nothing. So we finally asked for a status conference. And the defense also, like, what do they have to prove? What can we attack? So we went into court and we said, trial is very near. When are you going to tell us what we have to prove? And they said, we'll tell you that when we issue the judgment. So they said, prosecution, if we were in your shoes, we'd prove what you think you need to prove, and we'd prove what they think you need to prove. So it wasn't like going into an American court where you have really settled law. We were dealing with unsettled law at the time.
So you're arguing in the alternative.
Well, we always argued in the alternative anyway, but we were arguing, here's what we think, but if you believe this, we still prove that, right? So it was kind of the way we did it.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was your sense of it all? I mean, I realize it's sort of within the military. Next thing you know, you're in ICTY world, and you're now in the first trial. I mean,
Well, there's a lot to take on. Just getting up to speed on the law, on the complexity of international law, where you have the additional required proof with additional elements of transforming a murder or a rape or a torture into an international crime, because that's what we have jurisdiction over. We don't have jurisdiction over a simple murder or rape or torture. We have to make it a crime against humanity, which means additional proof. And so getting used to that, most of us had come from backgrounds where we had prosecuted the underlying offenses, with some exceptions. But this idea of now having to prove it as a crime against humanity, a war crime, et cetera, that was another layer of proof. And some of the forms of liability were forms of liability that we weren't accustomed to. And in fact, in the Tadich case on appeal, we appealed a finding of the trial chamber because we said there was a form of liability, we had argued at trial, of joint criminal enterprise, which goes all the way back to Nuremberg, but had not been used in states. So, and eventually that was accepted. And so that was expanding the law in terms of the understanding of the ways that you or I could be responsible for a crime committed by someone else. So it was very challenging in that regard. And we had a lot of very heated internal discussions about the extent of the law. For example, we had a big discussion about command responsibility. Mm-hmm. And some of the people from the legal advisory side were saying, no, that can only apply to military, never civilians. And those of us who were basically practitioners said, where does it say that? Show me where it says that. And we argued it applies to anyone that you can prove the elements against, whether it is a formal commander or whether they have actual power, even if they don't have formal power. And we prevailed on that in terms of the prosecution position. But it was very interesting because you're talking about substantive law, procedure, and really what do we think the state of the law is now 50 years after Nuremberg. So it was interesting.
50 years after Nuremberg. Was Nuremberg a source of assistance?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In what way?
General principles of law at Nuremberg, and they had also dealt with some of the things we were wrestling with in terms of the underlying acts. And so we could look to them and see the state of law at that time, but then we had to overlay the changes in the law since then to see how much of that remained valid today, given the advances in law. But we started with the fundamentals of Nuremberg.
I'm just curious, I never even thought about it or asked the question. Did anybody ever take judicial notice of certain rulings that, of the Nuremberg trial? You know, in our world, that's sometimes a standard precedent. You just take judicial notice of it.
No, we didn't have that to my recollection,
Yeah.
not of that. Eventually, we had the judges take judicial notice of some things.
Yeah.
For example, at the Rwanda Tribunal, after many, many, many cases that had gone all the way up to appeal, they finally judicially noticed that a genocide had occurred in Rwanda, which meant you didn't have to prove that aspect of your case. The underlying acts, you still would have to prove. The liability of the accused, you'd have to prove.
You were involved also in a reopening of a case I can't pronounce, in which rape was charged as torture.
Oh yes, Forunzia.
Yeah.
We had closed out that case and then came to realize that we had material we should have disclosed that was relevant to a witness. And we then disclosed that, and it required a reopening. I hadn't been a part of the original case, but then they brought me in to do the case on reopening. And it was an interesting case, and it dealt with the psychological and mental impact of trauma on a person's ability to remember and to remember accurately. So it was interesting in that regard. The Rwanda Tribunal had already recognized that trauma of itself doesn't make a witness incredible. You can believe them. You don't have to say they're not worthy of belief because they're traumatized. But you have to look at the circumstances to see how traumatized and has that impacted the person's ability to remember things in a certain order. And so that was really the issue that we dealt with in that case. But it was an interesting case because rape was charged as the underlying act of torture. And the victim had been horribly abused over a period of time as punishment for what other members of the family were doing, basically. So it was an interesting case, a very important case.
These early days of the ICTY, were there many females on the staff?
Yeah, there were. There were. We had, I worked with some very, very knowledgeable females. We had Nancy Patterson, for example, had been in the Manhattan DA's office, had been of the ones advising Law and Order on getting their procedure and everything right. She was an excellent attorney, and she worked on our cases. In fact, she wrote the Milosevic indictment. We all chipped in, but that was Nancy's craft for that indictment. So yeah, we had a lot of impressive women, and of course Louise Arbour became our second prosecutor. One of the most knowledgeable, intelligent, perceptive attorneys I've ever had the pleasure of working with. We would have these discussions, and we would be really, really opposed in our views, and she'd come in and say, well, what about this, this, and this, and everybody go, of course. A brilliant woman. And then, of course, she was followed by Carla Del Ponte, who was also, it's interesting, the prosecutors we had were the prosecutors we needed at the time. Justice Goldstone kept us alive with his interactions with the international community as we were just starting. Louise Arbour advanced our cases with perception, with good judgment, making sure we had very solid legal positions. Carla Del Ponte was kind of the, you've told us you're going to do that forever, do it now, and sort of a name and shame in your face. I'm kind of an in your face kind of person, so I like that. But we needed that at that time. And then, of course, after that was Serge Bramartz, who came in as they had some big cases ahead of them, and was very good at organizing that and putting the right people in charge. So we were fortunate there that we had the right skill sets at the right time in that job.
During that time that you were there, you had Milosevic in custody.
No, they got him after I left.
Oh, afterwards? Okay.
Yeah. I was there as we were finishing, I was in charge of finishing up the investigation, but they didn't have him.
Before we leave the ICTY, just for the camera, the Tadic case, how did that end up?
We lost a few things on a few of our charges at trial, but we won them on appeal. And the importance of the Tadic case was really to begin to get jurisprudence on exactly where we were procedurally, on these forms of liability, on elements of crimes. So that is today, I think, still kind of the bedrock case that people look back on for a lot of jurisprudence for international criminal law.
Then where? You go to the ICTY, but you stayed in the field.
Well, yeah, I mean, and literally in the field. I arrived at the ICTY on the 5th of July of 1994, and in August I had my first mission, and was in Bosnia, predominantly Bosnia. I also went to Slovenia, Croatia, but predominantly in Bosnia from the fall of 1994 until we started the Tadic case in May of 1996. So a lot of time in a very active war zone. So that was a very interesting experience. So when I left the ICTY, I became a consultant for a period of time and worked with a couple of groups that wanted to bring things to the ICC in Colombia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Also did a lot of training with judges and prosecutors in various places. For example, Indonesia had ad hoc human rights courts. And so we did training with those judges and the prosecutors for that, and in other places. So I did that for a while, and then was asked to go to the Special Court for Sierra Leone in September of 2002, and they had just stood up. Dave Crane had come that summer. He was starting to bring his people on board. He still didn't have a full complement for his staff. And we weren't the court hadn't even been built yet. So we worked at his residence, Seaview in Freetown. And so I was a consultant for him from September and with a short break until June of the next year. And that's when we did our first missions, and I went out some of the first missions, and then he asked me to be acting chief prosecutor for 2 of the trial teams, and then also acting chief of prosecutions for a time. And so I was also involved with writing the indictments. Actually took them to London, where the special court judges were having their first plenary, presented them to a judge for approval, brought them back to the court. So then in June of 2003, then I left and went back and did other consulting during that time, and went back in 2005 when the prospects were good that they would get Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia. Desmond De Silva was the prosecutor at that time, and he asked me to come back to review the existing indictment, look at the evidence, see what we needed, and amend the indictment as needed. So I did that for 2005, and he said, you'll have 6 months or so to do that. Well, I went there, I think, in January of 2005, January or February, and we got Charles Taylor in March. And it was like, wait a minute, you said I'd have 6 months to do this. So it was a lot faster timetable than we thought.
Were you there when all of the gymnastics were going on with Charles Taylor, when you got him, when you finally got him, and the background concerning all that? Were you in the inner circle at that time? Did you know what was going on?
Well, in terms of the prosecution, I worked with them throughout that year and into the next year to prepare the case.
I think specifically, we had Desmond talk about when all the politics that was going on behind the scenes to get the Americans to put a lot of pressure on.
He would, Desmond would tell us about that. Quite honestly, if you look at the Charles Taylor case, kudos to Dave Crane. He indicted a sitting head of state when other heads of state, including in the United States, thought that was very taboo. So good for him. He indicted him. And Desmond brought him to the court because it was his ability to work with the British, with the Americans, with all of these others to arrange to get him to the court. So he got him there. And then Stephen came in and oversaw the prosecution, and I was the lead prosecutor for the prosecution. So I understood the things that were going on, but certainly was never in the meetings that Desmond was having to bring it about.
I mean, that is the marquee case of the Sierra Leone Tribunal, was Taylor. And, I mean, you got a lot otherwise going on, or so much more, but what can you tell us and tell the camera about Charles Taylor, the person?
I don't know much about him. He and I never had a chance to sit down and chat socially.
He called you out.
Well, he called me out several times. One time was a CIA officer. Another time was this poor, stupid woman that was just following along. But from what I saw in the courtroom, and of course from what I heard from witnesses and what I read, Charles Taylor was is a many-faceted man. Certainly if you had no idea about things he had been responsible for, you'd think, oh, this is a very charming, well-educated man, well-spoken. But that wasn't the Charles Taylor that we were prosecuting. And of course, at the trial, they tried to make it, this is the white man's trial, but his victims were black Africans. We weren't prosecuting him because he did something to some rich white person somewhere. He basically brought about the downfall of a country, and supported atrocities against many, many black Africans in that country and in his own country. So it was an interesting trial. It was interesting. The theatrics of the defense were interesting at times. There was one time where defense counsel just had a meltdown in court and just an outburst. And in fact, our case manager was, of course, with us in court that day. And a picture that we gave her as her going away was a picture of a still frame of the camera shot that caught her when this was going on. And it was something like, you couldn't believe that this was happening in a courtroom. So you had those asides as well. But it was a well-fought case. But it was an important case.
Finally, the case concludes, and then you start waiting for the judgment. And how do they tell you that the judgment is forthcoming? Like an email that says, we're going to gather together on a date certain?
Yeah, they issue an order that there's going to be a date that they will orally announce the judgment. And so then you go into court for that announcement.
Did you get it? You never know what is going to be.
You never know.
Did you have any trepidations?
They were taking an awful long time, and I thought, we put in an awful lot of strong evidence that we proved our case. Why are they taking so long? Maybe they don't agree with us.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, but nothing in the trial really, because I thought we put on a very solid case. I didn't think we had done anything that would undermine the credibility of our evidence. So from that point of view, I thought this is a very solid case. They should convict him. But again, taking so long, you always wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the day comes, you're sitting there, and they start reading. Did they announce their decision right up front, or did they have to read it? You have to read it and then wait.
Yeah. Well, no. They as part of the hearing, they say we find him guilty of da 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 da. But what I had told the members of my team is that when we're in court, it doesn't matter what they say, what the outcome is. You will be professional and stoic in your presentation.
It's on film. Because they're filming it.
Well, because we're professionals, and that's the way you should be.
Yeah.
And so we had talked about that. So, yeah, you listen with trepidation and you're thinking, okay, what's happening here? But then, of course, very satisfied with the outcome.
Sure.
But that was the findings on guilt, and then we had a separate hearing for sentence.
I have on video, because Jim shared it with me there, when Charles Taylor had a chance to talk about it. I don't know if it was before the judgment or before the sentencing, where he calls out you, calls out David, calls out Jim. Which one of those was that? Do you recall?
It was sentencing phase.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Yeah, well, you should see it. That's very good. You're called out.
Yeah. Well, in fact, we had a meeting with the press afterward, and my PA was with me. And Simon Charter is a great guy. He kept me in line. Jim and Simon kept me in line. But I don't know how it came up, but one of the things I said was, I wish I knew where that banking account was that the CIA put all my salary in, because I have no idea where it is. Because he had said I was a member of the CIA. And my PA, Simon, said, you shouldn't have said that. Now they'll think you did work for the CIA. Yeah, but then, of course, you have the trial judgment out, but then you've got to get ready for the appeal.
Appeals, yeah.
And we were going to have the appeal, and we anticipated some of the things the defense would probably appeal. So you immediately start working on the next phase of the process.
Do you have any say as to, ultimately, he gets sentenced for 50 years?
50 years.
Where he spends his time, or is that a court decision?
It's, the court, of course, doesn't have a prison. So you work with countries who are willing to take the prisoner, and you enter into an agreement with the country that they will take the prisoner. Now, the court retains jurisdiction over the prisoner, but that country is the one that executes the sentence.
But this isn't the end of your international criminal law career.
No.
You kind of do the big one, Charles Taylor, you're the prosecutor, and then Cambodia.
Yeah, I had become the reserve co-prosecutor for Cambodia while I was the prosecutor of the residual special court. And then in, I think, April, May maybe of 2019, I got contacted by the Office of Legal Affairs at the UN to say that the international co-prosecutor Nick Kumjian was leaving the Cambodia court, and he was going to head up the international investigative mechanism for Myanmar. And so they needed a new international co-prosecutor and asked if I would take that job. And upon reflection, I said yes, that I would. So in October, I think 4th or 5th of October of 2019, I was in Cambodia. And when I arrived, we had scheduled an oral argument before the pretrial chamber of one of the 3 cases that were pretrial. And so I spent the rest of October and into November catching up on that case, because I was going to do part of the argument. And then after that, we got a 256-issue appeal from the last appeal. It was the second appeal of 2 senior people in the Pol Pot regime. And so we began looking at that at the beginning of 2020, and then in February, we had the pandemic, and we had a lockdown, and people were told they couldn't come to the court. They had to work from home. I think that happened in March or April. I went to the court because there was nobody there, so it was safe to go. But we had people actually leave the country because they had aged parents or they had medical conditions that they needed to be closer to either their parents or to services. And so my deputy went back to Australia. 2 of my attorneys left. One came back to the U.S., another to Europe. And then the rest of the staff were working from home. We had interns. Most of them left. And after that, we couldn't have interns come in country. So we had people all over the world. So in addition to the issues that we had been presented on appeal, one of the most challenging things was, how do you have a meeting on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever when you've got people all over the world? Who do you inconvenience most for this meeting, and then we'll inconvenience someone else for the next meeting? But we were able, through modern technology, to continue our work. And the registry worked very closely with us to enable the people working remotely to have access, secure access to our database, because they needed that. Had it not been for technology, everything would have stopped. Everything would have stopped. But it went on, and we were able to meet our timelines for filing our response. We would get the drafts and by secure IT, and then I would check them and they'd go back out. And so that's how we were able to operate. Without technology, as I say, we wouldn't have been able to operate at all. So then that appeal we filed I think we filed it, I can't even remember now, 2021. We had oral argument in 2021. And then we also had briefs we filed on our other 3 cases. All of those were dismissed at the appellate level. So by the end of 2021, the appeal had been decided in our favor. It was the second appeal. The 2 people, Nguyen Chia and Kusampan, had already been tried, convicted, sentenced to life, and those convictions had been upheld. Now we had a second trial on different charges because the judges separated out the trials. And they were both convicted, again, life sentences. Nguyen Chia died after the judgment at trial, but before the appeal was heard. So it was only Kusampan that was alive for the appeal. So they affirmed the second life sentence, but of course you can only do 1 life sentence. So they served those together. They would be concurrent. And interestingly, and very importantly for jurisprudence, we had 1 issue on appeal, and it dealt with males who had also been forced into forced marriage. Because the trial chamber had found that there were crimes committed against the women who had been forced into these marriages, but they didn't find that the harm to the men was serious enough. And we said, yes, it is. And we argued an unconscious bias had led to that, the idea that for men, sex with anyone, anywhere, anytime is sex, and it's great and there's no harm. And we said that is a false stereotype. And we have evidence on record to show that these men did suffer. And in part, the way they suffered was that, in essence, they were a tool being used to rape these women, because these women weren't consenting to the marriages, and they had forced consummation of the marriages. And they actually monitored the consummation. And so you had these men who didn't know this woman often before they were married, didn't want to be married to this woman, but they were forced to have sex with this woman. Often she didn't want it, and so they were forcing them to basically commit rape as their tool. And so some of the men felt that very strongly. Other men were either married or they had people they were in love with. They didn't want to be married to this person. So we put all that together, we argued that, and the appeals chamber accepted our argument, that indeed males can be victims of forced marriage, which indeed is true. So I thought that was a very important accomplishment for the office.
Because that was a first.
Yeah.
Jurisprudence. Once these appeals had occurred and the case had been kind of concluded, were you there kind of at the end when Cambodia Tribunal? You were at?
Yeah.
Locked the door?
Oh, no, it didn't lock the door.
Right,
Just like with this special court, it transformed into a residual court.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I was there at the end of the judicial functioning, the primary judicial functioning of the court as it transitioned. And in fact, at the end of December of 2021, I lost all my staff, except for 1 attorney and some support staff. So, but we had other things that we had to do. For example, at the Cambodian court, the prosecution was responsible for conditions of imprisonment, and we had this very elderly sick man in jail. So we had to monitor that and to make sure that the conditions of the prison he would be transferred to in Cambodia would meet his medical needs, his physical needs. And so we worked very hard on that. And also just with the court had a duty to reclassify evidence to the extent it could, from confidential to public, et cetera. So they had to review all of this. So we, before we actually closed the court, had filed a very lengthy submission about kind of a roadmap as to how we thought they should do that to protect sensitive information, but to maximize what could be made public. So we had things we were doing, but after 31 December of 2021, I had one attorney working with me to do that. And then, of course, in July, 9th of July, I left the tribunal, the court, Cambodian court. So it's interesting because I arrived there like the 4th of October, 2019. I left the 9th of July, 2022. I never left Phnom Penh.
Really?
Because I had to get ready for the oral argument, and then I was looking at the appeal, and then the pandemic. You couldn't leave because wherever you went, you'd be in quarantine. When you came back, you'd be in quarantine. I didn't have the time to do that.
Did anybody have a check on you?
Yeah.
So you are essentially the person who realizes there's all these residual mechanisms, but Sierra Leone and Cambodia, it's Brenda Hollis. Does the prosecutor of the ICC know what's going on when he brought you on? This is your reputation? The closer?
That's right, the closer. Yeah, well, a little bit of a different situation, I think.
Just kidding. We're the same age.
I
And
doubt it. I think you're younger, probably. You look much younger.
thank you. And that's not accurate. But you have had a moral compass like no other. And I'm not going to blow you up with a glory gun, but you read this resume. I mean, this here, which is just a Josh Heintz Award resume, and really since early on in your life, whether it's in the Peace Corps and working its way through, you have really been on a wonderful, amazing trajectory, but very consistent, dealing with fairness, dealing with you've had a moral compass, like really I've never met. And I didn't necessarily react, but I'm reacting. It's remarkable. It really is. Do you ever pause and have you ever really you've seen so much, and you think about the crimes that you've had to prove and the evidence you've had to present, you get jaded?
I don't think jaded. I think in some ways saddened. I think one of the things that you experience if you do this job, and if we do it a short period of time, a long period of time, is that you see the best and the worst in people. So you see people who are willing to commit evil acts and can try to justify it. And then you see people who have had everything in their life taken away from them, and yet they're able to move on. And people who have the courage to come forward and tell a court about that, and yet go back to an area full of perpetrators who supported the people they've testified against. So the resilience of the human spirit, the courage, but also the capacity for evil, and the powerful tool that propaganda is, to take people that without that propaganda would not engage in these things. Maybe they'd like to, I don't know, some of them, but they wouldn't do it without this road, this propaganda road. So you start by identifying a group as an enemy, and that group is responsible for all of the bad things in your life. And they're going to do bad things to you if you don't do something bad to them first. And they're certainly not like us. They don't look like us. They don't have the same religion. They don't speak the same language. They don't wear the same clothes. So they're not like us. And they're not even really human like we are. And the more you go down that road, the easier it is to be violent toward these people. And you get encouraged for it. You get rewarded for it. And unfortunately, I think we see that in the United States today. but it's a powerful tool. It plays to sort of that primitive brain that we have. And so that's a very sad thing. But then you talk to people who tell you stories like the one I heard in Bosnia. It was a man who had not gone to the killing camps, but he had been at a camp where they were basically finally ethnically expelling people. And while he was there, though, they would make him go out and just pick up pieces of bodies to bury. And some of them were people that he knew. And he told of his sister who lived with him in this mixed area. They were Muslims and Serbs. He was a Serb, his sister was a Serb. He had been off doing something when their area was attacked. And because she was a Serb, the attackers who were Serbs said, well, you come over here. And she said, no, these are my neighbors. These are my friends. I stay with them. And we have no idea what happened to her. Very, very, very likely dead. But she could have saved herself. She could have stood in this line, but she stayed in that line. And the kind of courage that takes. But the kind of courage it takes to suffer these things, the young women who were so horribly violated sexually and have to go on with their lives. So in a way it saddens but also gladdens you because you see both sides of the spectrum.
What's a question I should be asking Brenda Hollis that you I think willingly came here today to be interviewed?
I did, yes.
And the question you expected from me that I haven't asked yet?
Nothing really, Greg, nothing.
Nothing about Jim Johnson we could talk about?
Jim Johnson's a great guy. I always kid people in the international court community that the reason some of them have stayed married for so long is that they're never with their spouse. And Jim came to Sierra Leone, I think probably thinking a couple of years, and he stayed there for 9-10 years, because that was duty to do that. But he's the most devoted family man I've ever met. And so for him to be away from his family, his wife, for all those long periods, truly extreme sacrifice. But he was also the one who had the job to be my political correctness monitor. Not an easy job. Bill Smith at the Cambodia court took over, and now it's Alex Demerjian at the ICC. So he was my political correctness monitor, but he was also kind of the reasonableness sounding board. What do you think of this? What about that? Well, maybe not. And you think about that when Jim says, maybe not, or maybe this. I have to think about that. So my life certainly has been enriched by my professional and personal association with Jim and Pam. Pam would send up food to me when I was prosecuting Charles Taylor in The Hague. Very fortunate to have them as friends.
We're very fortunate to have you here and being part of the Robert Jackson Center and the International Law Dialogue / Roundtable, and just to consider you a friend. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Ed, Jim, got any last questions? Not opening anything, huh? It was great. Thank you. Anything here that you certainly have the benefit of reflection on this, that you say, because all we normally try to do is put this on YouTube, because I think this is a huge educational tool.
You know what, I don't know if you've had any representatives of victims groups who are actually victims here. But for example, in Sierra Leone, they have a victims group for amputees, they have other victims groups. And I know that there are attorneys that speak for them, but I think have someone that is from that victim group, or for example, in West Africa, one of the reasons that we had peace agreements and one of the reasons that we had courts was because of the market women, strong women who put enough pressure on. I think South Africa also, women played that role. And so to highlight that sort of thing more, I think might be good. Yeah, child soldiers are kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah,
because,
exactly.
For example, amputee society, that sort of thing. I think it'd be very interesting to hear from somebody from the market women, because again, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, I think maybe even in South Africa, they really pushed. And it was interesting, we had one meeting and one of the ladies, I forget where it was or what it was about, but one of the attendees was a woman who'd been very instrumental in bringing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And she said, you know, we had women working very hard to put it together, but as soon as it was ready to become a formal thing, the men were the ones who sat around the table, not the women. And it sort of reminded me of a line in the movie that Bette Midler was in, The Rose. And she was in New York City at Central Park with a concert. And she's leading up to some song, and she says, "What are we, girls? What are we? We are waitresses at the banquet of life." And I thought that was great. That was a great saying. You know, we talked to a young man in Sierra Leone who had been captured, and he was a very narrow-framed young man and apparently scarred very badly because they had carved RUF into his chest. But because he didn't have a broad chest, it covered his chest, and it probably stuck up about that much. And he wanted to have it removed because people thought he was a willing participant in this war. And then the picture, Jim, you remember, of the man was before our jurisdiction, but in the first time that they went after them for elections, they had carved all over this man, and then they had cut parts of him off. You remember that picture? It was absolutely horrible, absolutely horrible. And then the women and girls that were first serially raped, and then if they were lucky, according to one of our witnesses, an insider in the RUF, if they were lucky, they became a bushwife, because the others, he said, were just kicked around like a football from person to person. But yeah, you cannot imagine. You cannot imagine what that would be like. I can't imagine that.